Alright students, welcome to 3D Studio Max. For this part of the lab we are going to be exploring the viewports. Now, when you open up this software, it is really tempting to click around and play and see what happens, but this software is extremely complex and it is very important in order to set yourself up for success to explore things one step at a time. It is easy to get lost or overwhelmed if you don't go in with a plan. So our plan for this part is to get an idea of what we are seeing on screen and learn a bit how to navigate it. So our navigation.max file that we opened is a simple file that contains a 3D world with one object in it, this teapot here. And it is located in the middle of our world at the origin point. This little grid down here is a visual indicator of the middle of the world. Okay, so the first terminology that we're going to define here is viewport, and this is a viewport right here, this middle area that shows us our scene. And the first thing we're going to work on is how to change the appearance of what we see in the viewport. So right now we see our teapot. It looks kind of shaded. We see a few shadows here and there. It looks okay. And we're sort of viewing it from a slanted front angle. So let's take a look, and we can see at the top there are a few options, and the first one says perspective, and basically what that says, what that means is that we are viewing the teapot with a 3D perspective. We can see depth, we can see shading, we are looking at the teapot in 3D, and we'll work more with that in a little while. The other option on the right currently says default shading. If you click on that, you'll get a whole bunch of different options here, and each of these changes the appearance of what we're seeing in our viewport, namely the appearance of the teapot. So if we click on some of these, we'll see that the appearance changes. So first we're going to select wireframe override. And we see now that rather than a shaded representation of our 3D model, we see what's called a wireframe representation of our 3D object. So we can see the lines that define the shape in 3 dimensions. Next, I'm going to select this one called hidden line. And we can see that now we see our shaded teapot, and we also see those lines that define the shape. There's another one. There's a few others. They all kind of each have their own application, but feel free to play. If you go into the Stylize panel, there's some fun ones that you can find. So if we click on acrylic, our teapot is now shown almost cartoony in appearance. There's a few different ones in here. Please feel free to play around for a moment with those, but when you are done, we are going to switch back to our default shading. As we explore those different shading options, it might be worthwhile to imagine in your mind for a moment how some of these different settings and different appearances that we can select from might be useful when we're building a scene in 3 dimensions, why we might want to see our objects in different ways. So the other thing we can do in the viewport is to take a look at the object itself. Right now we've been looking at the teapot from one angle, from one perspective. But what if we wanted to change our perspective? What if we wanted to look at the back of the teapot, or look at it from the spout, or look at it from the handle, or even from the top looking down? It might be tempting to click and drag, and if you try that yourself, you'll see that it really doesn't do much of anything. So let's take a look at how we can change our perspective. Before we do that, take a quick look in the lower left corner here. We can see a tiny little representation of our gizmo, indicating our Z direction going up, our X direction going to the right and to the left, and our Y direction going forward and backward. And since we're sort of viewing at a slant, That's why our gizmo is sort of at a slant. So how can we change our perspective? There are a few different ways to do this, and the first one that we are going to use is the view cube. And we can find the view cube by hovering in the upper right corner of our viewport with the cursor. And we can see when we move away, it disappears. That might seem strange to you, but it is very handy that it disappears once we're working with a more complex scene, because the last thing we want when we've got a lot of geometry and a lot of objects in our scene is stuff covering it up. So the fact that it disappears when you move away from it is kind of useful. So what can we do with this thing? Well, first, let's take a look at what happens if we click on the front. Whoop, there we go. We now see our teapot from the front. Notice now we have these little arrows that have appeared. Let's see what happens when we click on those guys. Whoop, there we go. There we go. Cool. So we can navigate around very simply, looking at our object from different angles. Useful. But there is another thing that we can do with this. If we click on the view cube and we drag it around, we can actually toggle around and see our object from all sorts of angles. And as we drag, I'd like you to take a look in the lower corner of our viewport and notice that as we drag the view cube and our view of the teapot changes, we also see an indication of how we are moving around in 3D space using the gizmo. You can see the gizmo moves as well along with our view of the scene. All right, so let's let go and pretty much get back to where we started. But what if we wanted to see multiple views of our teapot at once? What if we were working on this teapot and we didn't want to keep having to move around to see the back and the front each time we made a change? That is what our next video is going to be about, how to change our viewports so that we can see multiple views of our teapot at the same time.